Hi, this is the third installment of the review for Chapter 3 concepts. We're going to be looking at predetermined and applied overhead next, specifically focusing on problems 18 and 45. Let's look at problem 18. We're given some information about Enrique Mayer's Enterprises. They use direct labor hours to apply overhead, and they have the following data available for the year. We know that the expected direct labor hours were 600,000 and the actual were 545,000. The applied overhead was 2,937,550 and the actual overhead was 2.8 million. What predetermined overhead rate did Enrique Mayers use? Well, we know that in order to calculate the applied overhead, the formula is the predetermined overhead rate times the actual hours gives us the applied overhead. In this case, we don't know the predetermined overhead rate, and that's what we're trying to calculate. So we simply solve for x. To do so, we're going to take the predetermined overhead rate times the actual hours, which were 545,000 equals the applied overhead of 2,937,550. If we rearrange the formula, our predetermined overhead rate equals the 2,937,7 divided by the actual hours. So the predetermined overhead rate in this case was $5.39 per hour. If you remember, when we calculate our predetermined overhead rate, we use that rate against the actual labor hours in order to calculate the applied overhead. In this case, the applied overhead was more than the actual overhead. Therefore, we over-applied our overhead. Let's look at number 45, which is a comprehensive example, and it shows how the choice of cost drivers impacts the overhead calculated. Here we're looking at a company where the company's president is unsure about how they're allocating the overhead. He's asked the controller to come up with some different allocation methods and cost drivers. The income statement is prepared below using basic assumptions. The company expects to sell 10,000 pairs of boots, and they estimate that the employees will work 10,000 hours and expects that the production equipment will operate for 8,000 hours in total. Sales are budgeted at 1 million. Cost of goods sold are budgeted at direct materials costing 300,000, labor costing 160,000, and overhead is expected to be 240,000. Selling and admin expenses are 175, giving us a total net income of 125,000. Part A asks us to calculate the predetermined overhead rate using the following three cost drivers: labor hours, direct labor dollars, and machine hours. So what does this mean? First, we're going to use the estimated overhead to calculate the predetermined overhead rate. So we don't have any actual results yet, and we're using this to come up with a budgeted rate, which is also known as the predetermined overhead rate. So in all of these cases, our overhead is $240,000. So you could see I've broken them out by direct labor hours, direct labor dollars, and machine hours. So it's going to be the same overhead costs for each of these. Sorry, the formula didn't quite work there. Of 240,000. Here's where they differ, is the cost driver. So direct labor hours, we go back to our assumptions, and we're assuming direct labor hours of 10,000 hours right here. Okay, so 10,000. Excuse me. For direct labor dollars, we look here, $160,000. And then machine hours is estimated at 8,000 machine hours. And then we simply divide our overhead estimated overhead divided by our cost driver to come up with the predetermined overhead rate. $24 if we use labor hours, $1.50 if we use labor dollars, and $30 if we use machine hours. So what does this mean? Let's look at Part B. If actual labor costs were $170,000 for 10,500 hours, direct labor hours, and actual machine hours of 7,800, what would be the applied overhead according to the predetermined rates that we computed above? So here's where the different rates come into play to calculate the applied overhead. So the actual of each cost driver. So we had actual labor hours of 10,500, actual labor costs of $170,000, and actual machine hours of 7,800. Now we're going to use the predetermined overhead rate that we calculated above. So if we are looking at direct labor hours, it was $24 per hour. So 10,500 actual hours times our rate, predetermined rate of $24 gives us applied overhead of $252,000. If we're basing it off of labor hours, our rate was $1.50. And 170 was our actual times our rate of 150 gives us an overhead applied of 255,000. And then machine hours is $30 per hour. So actual machine hours of 7,800 times our predetermined rate is 234,000. So you can see that the applied overhead is going to be different based on the cost driver that we select. So as a company, we would choose the cost driver that is most relevant and is most related to how those overhead costs are being derived. So let's compare our actual overhead versus our applied overhead for each of the cost drivers. So our actual overhead in all of these cases is $229,000 per Part C. So compute the amount of over or under applied overhead, assuming the actual is $229,000. So that's going to be the same for all the scenarios. And then we take the applied overhead that we calculated above, 255 and 234, and then we subtract those. So we have the applied overhead minus our actual. We have over applied overhead in each of these scenarios. Which one, based on these results, which cost driver do you think most closely drives the bulk of the costs for this organization? I would say it would be machine hours, because the difference between the actual overhead and the applied overhead is the lowest for this cost driver. Hopefully these videos have been helpful in clarifying some of the concepts that we talked about in Chapter 3. Thank you.